kommunistische Organisation. Podcast.
Welcome, dear listeners, comrades, to another episode of our podcast of the kommunistische Organisation. My name is Locker, and I am joined today by Vashna Jagarnath. Vashna, welcome to the show. Nice to having you.
Thanks for having me.
And you are a member of the SRWP, that's the Socialist Revolutionary Workers Party of South Africa.
Yes.
And you are the Deputy General Secretary, and you're also active in Pan-Africanism today. Maybe later in the show you can, we will come to this point, what's like the meat of the work you do there. But mainly you are a labor activist and an historian. So once again, welcome.
Thank you.
So we were having you scheduled, planned. You were to speak on our Congress back in October, and then this could not happen, and it was because of a power outage in your end. So maybe you explain a little bit what's the situation with this in South Africa for people who are not familiar with this problem, and and then we take it from there.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we're lucky now. For the past few weeks, we've had no power outages. So in South Africa, we have a huge energy problem, which has mainly been brought about. I mean, under apartheid, we had very cheap energy and electricity, which is provided by the state, but it was also only provided for a particular group of the population. There was not widespread electrification. And obviously under apartheid, we've got widespread electrification, but at the same time, there has been very low maintenance of any sort of our energy structures. It has been widespread corruption in the sector. And so as a result, we've ended up having a lot of what we call in South Africa load shedding, where they're literally shedding the load of the energy off. And in those times, we don't have electricity. Sometimes it's up to 8 to 9 hours a day in different blocks and periods where we don't have electricity. And it has been occurring now for the past, 10 to 12 years on and off. We've had periods where we've had very stable electricity, but recently, especially in the last 2 years, we don't have it. And what ends up happening is we have a schedule so we can time it. But then in addition to that, when they're coming back on, we have things that, breakages, circuit breakages, and so on that lead to other issues. And it's had devastating consequences on our economy, obviously, which I'm sure we'll speak about more in a minute.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so when you say there's times where it's more stable, what happens? Like, what's the precondition for it to work better? Is it because also of the time of the year, less energy consumption, or
Well, yeah, they make arguments that it's about the time of year, so less energy consumption, or we obviously largely coal. We use a lot of coal as our base load to provide the energy. Mm-hmm. And they now say, sometimes the coal gets wet from rain because they haven't been to keep the coal dry. So if it's a rainy season, but actually it can happen at any time. And I mainly think it depends, right? So, for example, rugby is incredibly popular in South Africa. We all love rugby, which is a sport. I know you don't play it in Germany, but it's very popular here. During the World Cup, which we won, we had electricity. There was no load shedding during the times we were playing, for example, or when there's elections coming up, which is now, hence we probably have a whole lot of electricity. So it depends on the time. But there's a lot of issues within the industry. And, one of the things we're going to speak about is the role of imperialism, continued imperialism in Africa. And one of the things we had to sign was this renewable energy contract, where we have to stop coal-fired power stations, and as a result, there's not been maintenance done on those stations. So there's a lot of breakdowns. And we're not saying we're against renewable energy. Obviously, everyone's for renewable energy, but it's a bit hypocritical when we have to take on the load of the sort of sins that have been committed by the global north historically. Now we have to pay the price for it, A. But B, at the same time, our coal is being exported to places like your own country in Germany. So you all can continue to have energy, but we are now taking on the burden of not doing that. So it becomes quite difficult for us. And I think it's a lot to do with the politics rather than actually the mechanics of being able to give us energy.
Yeah, interesting. And I think, if it's a subject in our media here, then it would be portrayed very much as a problem of corruption. And so they try very, very hard to portray it as a internal South African homemade problem. And I remember reading an article where it was really going into the nitty-gritty of the leadership of the company. Sorry, I forgot what it was. Eskom, yeah. And what's going on there? The scheme they are running there. And but what you mentioned now with the contracts regarding renewable energy, that adds a whole new layer to it, and I think it's often overlooked especially in the West.
There's also another thing at play, obviously, is because Eskom's a state-owned entity, right? And within the neoliberal dispensation across the world, there's been a project to sort of discredit and defund state-owned entities and nationalized entities in countries so that they can privatize. So under that sort of privatization project, we've had that not just in Eskom, but in all our state-owned entities in South Africa. And we had a lot of really well-run state-owned entities. And under the neoliberal dispensation, funding has been withdrawn. All of these, there's been an absolute way in which it is portrayed as corruption. And there's obviously very real corruption. I'm not saying that that's not there. But the corruption can set in because there is a project anyway to discredit it as an entity, to defund it, to make it not work so it can be privatized. And so it's also part of that. So it's a deeply political problem as well. And it's arising from both internal and external policies because we as a government have accepted that external international dispensation of privatization.
Absolutely. Let us take a step back and to better understand the political landscape in South Africa, and especially with regards to the upcoming elections. But first of all, your party is very much how to put it? As I understand it, it's a central part to understand the political landscape, because there was a split, right, in the trade unions back in 2013 between the big one, and then NUMSA came out of it, and then also there maybe as a consequence, later on there was a split in the Communist Party, right? And so what happened in the union landscape reflected then in the political landscape. And then we have the economic freedom fighters. And I guess my question would be, how would you describe the landscape at the moment? Where is your party positioned with regards to the upcoming election? What's your relationship to the economic freedom fighters? And maybe it was a little bit broad, but I'm sure you can make sense of it.
Yes. Yeah, well, I think it's very important. I mean, went back to 2013, which is incredibly important. That is when there was a split between NUMSA, which is the largest well, it's the largest metal workers union on the continent of Africa. It's also the largest union in South Africa itself. And it's the Metal Workers Union. So not to be confused with NUM, which is our Mine Workers Union. So NUMSA actually splits off from COSATU, was expelled from COSATU. It doesn't purposefully split off. It was expelled because it took a very good line that the ANC had lost its interest in working for the good of the working class, in actually putting forward policies and changing the government and changing the economy in favor of the working class, that it had completely abandoned that project. And so it called for the removal of the then president, Jacob Zuma, and it was then expelled from COSATU. And as a result, a lot of the leadership within NUMSA were both within the South African Communist Party and within the African National Congress. They were removed from those organizations, and NUMSA itself had supported those organizations, obviously under COSATU. So it moved to form its own federation, which it did called SAFTU, the South African Federation of Trade Unions. It's got about 890,000 members at the moment, made up of different unions. And they also then took the resolution to create what was then a united front, a sort of broad-based left united grouping, as well as a sort of political party that was there for the working class. So it really comes out of the political work of a trade union, which is really interesting because often it is, political organizations and parties that are vanguarding and working within the labor organizations and within trade unions. But here it was actually the trade union that takes this decision and becomes a key sort of leader within South African politics. And it was known in 2013 as the NUMSA moment. And it became quite a defining moment in our post-apartheid politics. And NUMSA works very closely with all sorts of organizations, including Abashlali Basamjondolo, which is a shack dwellers organization in South Africa. That's a very large organization as well. So it's a trade union, but it does a lot of political work. It's very politicized trade union. Obviously, at the same time, it doesn't push a political line. We have to organize everyone, but there is an understanding of the orientation of this organization. And South Africa as a country has a very long history of labor playing a very key role in politics. So I think it's the continuation of that. For this elections, I mean, we've had, as an organization and a party, we faced quite a difficult few years. COVID has been obviously incredibly difficult. In South Africa, we had really, really strict and stringent lockdown measures for over a year and a half. So it was really quite a difficult time for us to organize. And as a result, the organization, the party really struggled. One of the things is that while the party is separate from NUMSA, a lot of the leadership is both within the labor movement and in the party. And obviously under COVID, like all over the world, labor really struggled. So there was a lot of pressure within the labor movement and within our union as well. So a lot of our work went to try and stay alive in that era. As a result, we are now in a moment of reassessing what we're going to do, the format of the organization, the way we want to run it, what it is we'd really like to do. So we are in that period. So we're not contesting elections at this point. We would really like to think about what it is that we would like a communist organization that is for and embedded from within the working class to look like, and how we're going to take that forward. Given our understanding now about, we always theoretically understand as a communist the issues of bourgeois elections and the electoral system and how you use it as a sort of tool. It's not really, we don't think this is going to bring about the communist revolution. But the point is that even then, it's still an incredibly difficult space to make an impact, even when you are part of bourgeois electoral politics and are in those structures such as parliament and so on. So we are in that moment of reassessing. But broadly in South Africa right now, we're in this is probably the most defining elections that we are going to have since 1994. And the reason is, firstly, a lot of those, what we call the born frees, the new generation of people who were not born under apartheid, will be voting for the first time. So that brings in a lot of interest into how they're going to vote. For a lot of us, there's a historical connection to the ANC. There's a lot of, nostalgia. You feel nostalgia for an organization that you were part of your whole life. Your family's histories are embedded within those organizations. But with this younger generation, they grew up in a very different sort of era. So there is that as a factor. We're not sure how it's going to play out. Many people posit a variety of different things around that. We also are in, as I mentioned earlier, the stage of incredible load shedding, which has brought about a massive economic depression within our country because it affects the economy. You can't run businesses, you can't run factories, and so on. And like ESCOM, there's been a massive defunding as well as, huge amounts of corruption within the other state-owned entities, things like our railway system with PRASA and so on. So this has meant that, mines, for example, can't transport goods out of the country or to the harbors or to wherever it needs to go on rail because they don't actually work anymore. So it means that our mining sector is really struggling. It also means that in general, the economy is struggling in retail and all of those areas, which has now become one of the largest areas of our economy in South Africa. We have a massive unemployment rate at the moment. The official rate is 32.5%, but that is actually for people who are still looking for jobs. It doesn't include those that have given up, like those who are not actively applying. So if you're not actively applying, then the number goes up to 44.1%. And we have around, I think it's like 40 million people who are workable age. And of that, there's only 11.5 million people who are working. And of that figure, only 9 million are employed in the formal sector. The rest are the informal sector. So it's incredibly difficult. So as a result, we are rated the most unequal country in the world. And I mean, I find that statistic, it's interesting. I mean, it's very troubling and worrying, but obviously we are rated the most unequal country in the world from countries who actually have statistics. There's countries that don't have any statistics at all about their employment and so on. So I think that should also be taken in when we are looking at that, but it's still not great. But what that means is we also then have a very huge grant system that is in place for people, social welfare grants, grants for children, pension grants, all of those things, which largely allow families to exist and live. It's not a lot of money. It's actually incredibly little amount of money. And with huge inflation, becomes more difficult for people to manage. So what does that mean for the elections? I mean, it means we are in a South Africa right now that's socially incredibly divided. It's divided economically between the rich and the poor. There's extreme wealth. I mean, 10% of the richest families count for 55% of all of the expenditure in our economy. And the bottom 10% account for only 0.8% of expenditure in our economy. So it's very, very divided in terms of that. Also, as you know, when there's huge economic divisions, you also end up having massive social pressure, and women usually bear the brunt of that social pressure. And as a result, we have one of the highest rates of gender-based violence in our country. Violence in general is incredibly high in our country, both through things like gangsterism and crime and so on. And that's a massive, massive problem in South Africa, the issue of safety. And then, like I mentioned, things like electricity. And increasingly now there's water shortages, just to add to it. So South Africa is really in this period of discontent, so to speak. And it's shown in a variety of ways. You have a lot of active work being done by social movements and by the labor movement, but then also politically in the sort of formalized political space, in electoral political space, you have a lot of changes that have been happening. What you've seen in the last, since basically around 2013, 2014, is that the ANC has increasingly lost power in all of the metros and the cities. It's effectively become quite a party that's rural. But what that has meant for the urban spaces is that you have alliance governments, which is a terrible thing. And it's increasingly those alliances are being made up of more and more splits. And so as a result, it renders a lot of the cities and the metros like they basically are not being governed properly. So you have a huge issue around that. So right now, the sort of main key players within our politics is obviously the African National Congress. Their recent sort of very, very deeply principled stance on Palestine has meant that there is a sort of resurgence of what the ANC had meant to so many of us. But that's obviously on an international front. It's quite contradictory in how it operates locally to its international work. And we have obviously the Democratic Alliance, which is basically a sort of right-wing, conservative, neoliberal organization and party, which sought to, for a period, introduce a sort of Black leadership into the organization, but has steadily in the last 6 years kind of just removed all of the key Black leadership from their organization. It's run by this woman called, what's her name? Helen Ziller, and she's incredibly quite authoritarian and quite a nasty piece of work. Then
is this alliance, this Democratic Alliance, like inheritance of the Nationalist Party?
Yes.
Or
well, it's both like the liberal whites under apartheid and the Nationalist Party. So it's both those things.
Okay.
Yeah, and it had quite a strong sort of base within what we call the colored population in South Africa. Colored population.
Colored.
Yeah. In Cape Town, in the Western Cape. So that's why they're quite strong there. But recently, obviously, with the Palestine issue, they've obviously not supported Palestine, and that has cost them quite a bit of votes, especially and I think will definitely cost them more votes in this election. A lot of support within that colored community, which is largely Muslim in the Western Cape as well.
Okay, so sorry for interrupting. The colored community is people who are not white and not black.
Mixed race people.
Mixed race, okay.
But it's a historical category, and it's a cultural community that come together from a particular history. So if two different people of two different races get married now in post 94 and they have a kid, that kid's not colored, that kid is just a person, but it's a special historical community that develops in South Africa. And that's
immigration from India and the Middle East and
Malaysia, South Africa, African community here, Malaysia, and obviously the European community.
Okay, thank you.
And and then you have obviously what we like to, and then you have a variety of other sort of smaller parties that are quite right wing in South Africa that are there, and they kind of very xenophobic. They push quite a neoliberal line as well. Some of them are black, some of them are white, like largely black in terms of its leadership and who it represents. And then also what you have is the sort of left politics, where you have something like what people tend to see as the EFF. The EFF definitely in its rhetoric is left. It's definitely has some of the left and the really good anti-imperialist lines from within the ANC, because it comes out of people from the ANC. But, the EFF is like everything. It's like a populist left thing. But it's just a populist organization, and people like to see it as left because of its rhetoric. But if you actually listen to the rhetoric, it's Marxist, it's Fanonianist, it's Black consciousness, it's everything, Sankharists, it's all the ists of the left that they have combined. But actually, it's just really quite popularist organization that has very, very deep lines of authoritarianism running through it. So it's incredibly worrying in that way. The EFF is incredibly worrying in that way for many people in this country. And it's not necessarily seen as the hope for the left at all. Here, it's seen as quite a populist organization. And in recent, and basically within this year, we've had a new party that's arisen beginning last year, but really coming into being and formation this year, is the Umkhonto we Sizwe party, which is the MK party, which the former president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, who was in the African National Congress, is now the leader of. And they have actually seemed to have gained a huge amount of popularity, especially in KwaZulu-Natal, which is the province from which Zuma comes from. But it's also doing quite well, I think, in general, and is coming quite close to possibly being the second largest, could possibly have the second largest amount of votes after the ANC in the upcoming elections. It's very worrying because the MK party has an incredibly authoritarian streak, similar to the EFF, but in addition to that, it has very conservative policies, especially around things like gender and so on. So, one of the things that that's in their manifesto is that all girls who are pregnant below the age of 16 or 16 and whatever will be sent to Robben Island, which is really scary. There's calling for compulsory conscription of all young men, and so on. So it's quite an authoritarian party in that sense. It seems to be quite right wing in some of its policies, but using a discourse of anti-imperialism. So that's also what the EFF do, is they use a discourse of anti-imperialism, but they are actually entrenching quite authoritarian and quite right-wing policies. That's what they're promoting or would implement. And what we have to understand is that's not unique to South Africa. You see that happening all over the world. I mean, the BJP is a classic example of that from India, where you can use an anti-imperialist rhetoric, but at the same time entrenching quite authoritarian, conservative programs. And, we know this all over the world. I mean, in Germany, the sort of reaction of like Hitler and the sort of Nazi movement is something that was against World War I and the horrors of that. So, and comes into being in a very particular. So you see this happening when people are oppressed, when they have nothing, when society is unequal, there is a move to that. People just use different rhetoric. In the post-colonial condition, it's very useful to use an anti-imperialist rhetoric because you can get people on board with that because it's a legitimate rhetoric. But what is being said underneath that is incredibly dangerous. And I think that's where we are at right now. And we have a situation where if the ANC get below 50%, it would have to go into an alliance with either of these organizations or with the Democratic Alliance. And all of that is incredibly bad. However bad the ANC is, an option of the ANC in alliance with any of those organizations is incredibly bad for the left.
Okay, interesting. I would have, like from the outside, I would have thought that it's good to have pressure on the ANC. And I also see a danger of the ANC being able to gain from the pro-Palestine sentiment. And like historically, you have a strong connection there, and it is ingrained into the party, the pro-Palestine action, and also the connection with Palestine. It's not just superficial. It's there, but and also I think the case which was brought to the ICJ by South Africa speaks to that it's deeply ingrained into the African National Congress. But at the same time, I could imagine or see that other forces which are more pro-imperialist would hide behind this really comfortable screen, and in the end change nothing in regards to South Africa's independence. And the economic freedom fighters, they say it in their party name, right? It's about economic freedom because they see and they address this. And I saw the interview with you're probably familiar with it. There's more than one, but with Julius Malema, and he was interviewed by the BBC. I think it was this format Hard Talk, and there he's really pushing back on this chauvinist rhetoric that comes out of the Western hubris towards the global South, and regarding like partnership with Russia. Then he's really pushing back and says, okay, if Russia needs weapons, we will send them weapons. And he knows what he's doing, but it's in line with this. We have to take a nationalist stance in the best sense of the word, right? And so maybe talk to us about what could come out of it if what is happening in Palestine is affecting also politics in South Africa. It brings motion and disturbances into the ANC, and so maybe there is potential there that the direction is a little bit corrected, because it is clear that there won't be a world before October the 7th, right? So there's no going back to it. And I think many in the leadership of the ANC and also in other parties are aware that the West will not forgive South Africa for bringing this case before the ICJ. However symbolic it may be, which I think it's not. It's not just symbolic. It's more than that. But I think they won't ever forgive South Africa for doing that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think. I mean, when I was saying that the options are bleak, I wasn't saying therefore the ANC is something we shouldn't be holding to account and challenging. I think we definitely need to challenge the ANC, and this is the problem we sit with, though. We're challenging the ANC, and we don't want the ANC to continue on the path it has, because this is why we are in the situation we are in presently, and having this discussion. But the fact is that the alternatives are also not great. So we need to be aware of that. And while Julius is really excellent and can say the things about our national interest, in actual practice, he has not demonstrated that there is a national interest. He's demonstrated there is a personal interest, the Julius Malema interest. And I think that is a problem for many South Africans. And that's, he's willing to use any rhetoric that suits him. He talks about being Pan-Africanist, but could also use incredibly xenophobic language when it suits him, and incite really xenophobic violence when it suits him. So it's not really a very sort of principled position that we see coming from him. It's what's at the moment that suits him. Yes, you can be anti-imperialist. And yes, you can claim to want to be in alliance with the Pan-Africanism agenda, but that Pan-Africanist agenda could be something that is like the African Union, which has no teeth. It's basically a dead-end thing. It's in rhetoric that you're doing that. You can talk about that, but yet call for the closure of all foreign shops, informal shops and businesses in South Africa. So it is a problem, I think. And I think Malema does have a good talk and can seem very attractive from the outside. But like I said earlier, it's very easy to seem attractive when you are espousing anti-imperialist discourse. I often think like, oh, wow, that person does sound great. That's amazing. We overlap on that. But then when you look at their gender policies, or when you look at their internal policies or their practices and what they actually say, it's two different things. So I think that's something that we have to consider there. In terms of the ANC itself, yes, I mean, the ANC has taken an incredibly principled stance in terms of Palestine, and you're absolutely correct. It's not something that is just on the level of discourse for the ANC. And for many South Africans, I think most Black South Africans, that's like African, Indian, and colored South Africans, there is a very deep sort of solidarity with the Palestinian people. And it's incredibly important. And, in all our working class formations, there's an incredibly deep solidarity with the Palestinians. And it's not just since October 7th. It's historically been the case. And when we march for our workers' rights, we usually have like our kafir with us, or we have a Palestinian flag on our marches. It's joined with our struggles, even if it's the housing struggle, a labor struggle, anti-racist struggle, any of those struggles, it's continuous. Even when we are looking at imperialism in Africa, if there's a protest outside the US embassy for something that's happening in Africa, it is always that the Palestinian issue is at the forefront of that. And that has been historically the case. We know the history of this very well. So it's something that's really embedded within the culture of South Africans. There has been, however, a huge pushback against that. And you are correct to say that the West and the global North won't forgive South Africa for doing this. And you find it very much actually present in our popular media, in our newspapers and stuff. A lot of the white-run newspapers funded by places out of the US and foundations, such as like the Daily Maverick, for example, and so on, will say things like, South Africa acted ridiculously. It's another stupid foreign policy of South Africa to isolate America. South Africa has destroyed our investment chances. Those kinds of things is what they say. Even the sort of neutral stance that South Africa took with the Russia-Ukraine war. So they have a huge agenda. They push a huge agenda to discredit the foreign policy of the African National Congress, which is actually an excellent foreign policy in most instances, and in most instances sticks to the historical tradition that is present within the ANC, even like our support of Cuba, our work with that whole sort of like 1970s and 80s, the sort of, tricontinental alliances that were happening, the global South solidarities. And South Africa sticks to that, and the ANC stick to that very well. But those things are constantly under attack. Within locally, especially from the white-owned press, and press that's very influenced by the United States of America and their different foundations that help fund it.
Are they smart about it in their approach, or is it backfiring?
No, they're incredibly stupid because, they do it in such obvious ways. What actually has been much more successful than the media has been the rise of sort of Pentecostal Christianity in South Africa, in changing the opinions of a lot of African South Africans towards Palestine. That has been interesting. In fact, that has had more effect in that, because there's some weird understanding of Zion and the return to the Holy Land of Christ and whatever tied to this. And anti-Muslim
sentiment, I take it.
Yeah, an anti-Muslim sentiment, but also very much a pro-Israeli state sentiment, weirdly enough. And that has come seeping in. I think that's had a bit more impact than the sort of, stuff that these people rant on about in the newspaper. It does, however, create some sort of hysteria economically in markets and in the bourgeois world. But on the whole, people... And it's quite racialized, the support of Palestine in South Africa. So obviously, white South Africans either stay out of it, or in the main, they're not concerned and they think we have no reason to worry about it, or they support Israel. So it's quite racialized in that way. And interestingly enough, amongst Indian South Africans, increasingly, it's in small numbers actually, you've seen a kind of slight support for Israel, which was never there historically. And that's coming out of the sort of Hindu fundamentalism that's happening in India. So it's happening in the Hindu population of South African Indians, where there's an anti-Muslim sentiment, because wrongly people make the Palestine issue a religious issue, which it's not. Like associated with Islam, which it isn't. It's an anti-colonial, anti-imperialist issue, and then they also, obviously, India for the first time has remained so-called neutral and continued to sell arms to Israel. So there is that issue that's been really interesting. That is creeping in, among certain South African Indians, which is very new as well. So those people have had more success in the sort of religious sphere than the media. But the media has definitely, the white-owned media in South Africa has either been silent or taken quite a negative view when they do report about it. And they've really pushed this also corruption line as rather than a political line in terms of the failures of the ANC. And they really, really report in quite racist ways about the African National Congress or African leadership in general, whether it's in the economic sector or the political sector. So for them, someone like Naledi Pandor, who's a brilliant foreign minister, who I think would probably be a brilliant president of our country, if only she was running for president, they just report on her as if she's, an ignorant buffoon, because it's quite racialized, in their reporting.
Okay, but listening to her, sorry, I never get the name right.
Naledi Pandor.
Naledi Pandor. And listening to her, I get the impression in one speech, I think it was to an audience of mostly women, and she said, okay, it's not enough to just come here and attend to this meeting. We have to be active, and she was addressing people in this sense. And I think, and it's hard to assess from the outside, but if you have an action on this high level, and with the case brought to the ICJ and her being so outspoken about the issue, then there's always the question, where does the mobilization of really the masses fit in? Because this is also important and not to be left out, because then it's fragile, right? This support.
Yeah, I mean, the support for Palestine in South Africa is incredibly, it's happening at all levels of society. So it's definitely happening on a mass base. So that's not even a question for us. South Africans are ready to protest, to mobilize, to be in support of the Palestinian issue. They're ready to boycott. They're ready to have sanctions, disinvest in things. So it's really not an issue. In the majority, it is definitely supported at all levels of society. I mean, it's really quite fantastic in South Africa. You go outside people's houses and there's huge murals, pro-Palestinian murals painted on their walls. It's in neighborhoods and so on. People have Palestinian flags that they're selling in shops everywhere, and people walk around with Palestinian scarves. It's really not something that is divorced from mass struggles. I know that in the labor movement, you cannot attend a labor movement discussion or meeting or protest or strike without Palestine being mentioned or Palestine being part of the discussion. And that's true even in the shack dwellers movement to everywhere. So I think that is happening. And she is right. We do need to do more. Obviously, people are on the streets every day and no one seems to be listening to us. So there obviously is more that has to be done. But when more is called upon, I definitely think that the South African people will rise up and stand there, because in the majority, they stand firmly behind what South Africa is doing internationally on this issue. And like you said earlier, the General Secretary of NUMSA, Ivan Jim, always, he's always says, I know he didn't come up with this, but he always says, like, solidarity takes and solidarity gives. Because solidarity is not charity, you're not just giving. And what's been really amazing for us as South Africans is it got so many people once again to remember what it's like to be in an organization that was once so amazing, so respectable, that had these really amazing views on the world and was incredibly principled. And so that's important. But also, I think, after the end of apartheid, for a lot of people, we assumed, okay, well, now we won. This is it. Like, we're going to live our lives. But, that's the problem, is when you win at that moment, that's when the work starts. Like, that's when we should have been working the most and holding the ANC accountable and activizing and continuing. But what's happened with the Palestinian solidarity is it's got a lot of people out again. A lot of people are returning to activism that had left it. Old people, and bringing young people into activism and so on. I mean, if you go onto TikTok and all these places, you see amazing videos that young South Africans are making, simple cartoons to teach young people about what's happened in Palestine. like beautiful things. So I think it's really, really beginning to get South Africans to think about that. And, the issues that Palestinians face, we also face. So it's in showing solidarity to the Palestinians, it highlights what we are going through, obviously not in this crazy war-like situation, but it also then allows us and gives us opportunities to make links once again with each other. We can be quite insular in how we organize, but an international issue can bring different sectors of activists together who normally don't speak to each other, but will have to over this issue. And those kinds of things are incredibly important. And I definitely see that happening. And I think that has brought back some support to the ANC because it's taken the stance. But I don't think it's probably going to be enough at this stage, given the conditions that we experience locally in South Africa.
Okay. You mentioned a few times the Twagshallers, and I think it would be worth elaborating a little bit on who they are, how they organize, what's their significance. And I take it that they have been targeted by a really, really brutal repression by the state or state-funded actors, including killings. And so why is that the case? Do they pose a threat to the establishment?
Well, I mean, Abishlali Basamjindolo, it began in 2006, and it's a shack dwellers movement that began out of protests that were happening around the lack of housing as a technical thing in South Africa, the lack of housing. So people live in informal settlements, shacks here. And it's more than just the technical requirement of a house. It's about the dignity of a person. It's about the dignity of South Africans. It's about what makes you a South African. It's enshrined in our constitution. It's about the recognition of that and their rights to that. So it's an incredibly amazing movement and organization that began out of protests in KwaZulu-Natal. And it's incredibly large now. I mean, they've got, I think, close to 160,000 members, mainly in KwaZulu-Natal, but outside as well in Gauteng, where I live now, the province. They've also got branches here as well. And they've grown under incredibly, it's very easy. It's much easier to organize in labor, right? It's incredibly difficult when you start organizing as social movements outside because the conditions are harsher. It's more difficult to organize, and living in shacks, which is often spaces that are quite transient, to be able to organize in those spaces. So they've grown incredibly well in that, and they're very well organized, and they have very sort of democratic leadership structures, largely made up of women. A lot of women are living in those informal settlements because they usually work as domestic workers in people's houses in the richer neighborhoods, in urban spaces. And so a lot of the leadership are women and run a lot by women. But they have faced huge amounts of repression because they've been incredibly good at showing up the failures of the state in what they're doing, and they've been, have had several assassinations of their leaders and young people and so on since they've begun, and it's been incredibly terrible. So they faced a huge amount of repression by both state actors and also different people within the tripartite alliance who are powerful, especially within KwaZulu-Natal, and it's become quite a thing in South African politics, assassinations in various ways, even within the ANC in different factions and so on. But Abishlali Basamjindolo have faced a disproportionately large amount of that repression. And so clearly they pose a threat to the state in various ways, whether it's just the state in KwaZulu-Natal or the state more nationally, they are seen as a threat. And while they are not a political organization in that they won't run for electoral politics, they are a social movement. I think having them on side or bringing them on board creates, or having them protest against you is a very huge, both culturally, socially, but also in terms of affecting you at the ballot is a huge problem for the governing party.
Okay. My next question is probably a little bit selfish. In terms of that we change the perspective and look at Germany or the West, but especially Germany. And I'm interested in how do you, I mean, you are a political person, but try to speak from a general South African perspective, like the sentiment in the population. If they look at the behavior of Germany regarding Palestine and what's happening there, how closely are people following what's happening on obviously the international stage, but also internally in Germany? I don't know if you are aware, but just last weekend there was a congress scheduled in Berlin to take place, the Palestine Congress, and it was shut down by the police. And this repression is going on all the time in Germany, even before October the 7th, but really it picked up after October the 7th, and there is the ban of certain speech. And then you have the police, which makes decisions on the ground if people assemble for a demonstration. And even if this demonstration is allowed by the authorities, then you still have to mess with the police in terms of they can at any moment decide we will ban now this assembly because it's one of the speakers mentioned this and that, or we have here the danger of crimes being committed in terms of hate speech or something like this. And so the atmosphere is really, really, really repressive. They try at all costs to signal to people, if you go to these things, you will be ostracized, because it's not so much the baton. It was also like beatings by the police, but it's more you get really shamed, and it's drilled in that those people who assemble for Palestine, they are Jew haters and stuff like this, yeah. And so my question is, how is it perceived outside of Germany? And yeah, what do you make of this?
Okay, so well, I mean, obviously, on an international, like a broad international level, understanding, South Africans understand that Germany is on the side of, well, not on the side of the Palestinians as a sort of policy level, and they understand that it's international policies, it's on the side of Israel, and they get that, but they just clump it with the general imperialist sort of project in the world, and that's how it's seen. It's seen as a West-led imperialist project. So it's not like, oh, well, let's think about Germany specifically, because I have to be quite honest with you, for the general South African everyday life, the only thing that I think when they think about Germany, it's whether it's about Mercedes-Benz or BMWs. It's about German products. I do remember for a while, I mean, obviously on a personal level, I've been following what's happening in Germany because of comrades I have in Germany, but also just because I'm interested in what happens in the world. South Africans are quite insular in a lot of ways. And when we do follow stuff, it generally tends to be what's happening in the United States. Like South Africans could give you a detailed analysis of what was happening, for example, during Black Lives Matter in the United States, or what happens in the UK. It's very, Anglophone kind of thing, and what our historical relationships have been. That's where it is. In fact, South Africans often can't really tell you what's happening in Zambia or Zimbabwe. For example, we would know much more what's happening in the United States and what's more happening in the UK than what's even happening on the African continent. That's for sure. So I think in terms of the general South African having any sense of what's happening in Germany, in terms of this, I do remember for a while on TikTok, there were some of those baton sort of when police were beating up Germans who were protesting early when October 7th happened, like I think it was in November or something. It was more like, oh my God, this is happening in Germany too. Like the German police are hitting people, like, wow, shock more than anything else, because in our imagination, it's such an ordered society that functions and works, and and this won't happen. So I think in that way, there's been that, but it's not something that's popularly thought about or discussed internally. But if there would be discussions, when there is discussions more in the academic circles, in the left circles, it is understood that Germany takes a very hard line, and it's tied to their own history of the Holocaust and all of those things, and how that happens. So I think there is that. But in general, it's not something that South Africans are thinking about. And when they do think about German foreign policy, it's just in line with the West. Like, this is what the West do. NATO. NATO is the word that gets used.
Okay, interesting. And that also leads me to the perception of what's going on in the Sahel region, in mainly West Africa. And I mean, you in a way answered this also, because I was also interested in the more broader sentiment towards the things that happen there, but maybe there's an exception that this is perceived.
The Sahel is interesting. I mean, when what's his name comes into power in
Senegal,
last year in Burkina Faso. You definitely have a sort of what's the word I'm looking for? An excitement around God, I can't believe I've forgotten his name.
Traoré.
Yes. When he comes into power, there's an excitement because he's like, very charismatic and he's young. So that was definitely on our news. It was popular here. People were interested, but it was like for that moment, it was that news item for the time. And he was very powerful, and he was sitting there telling like the elders off at the African Union, and he was, really taking on France. So in that instance, then those leaders definitely become quite popular here. And a lot of the students who are politicized take on leaders like that. But it is something that comes in for those like news moments. It's not constant. It's not like constantly on our news every day where we are, streaming in what's happening. In fact, some of the criticism is that we will have, like, on our 24-hour news channels, we'll have, if we get on international news, we'll probably have 80% right now at the moment will be Palestine. And very little on Africa, like, 20-30% is on the rest of the African continent. So a lot of the stuff that has been happening on our continent doesn't get reported. But obviously, like now, the recent elections in Senegal with Faye coming to power has been also reported, and so on. But I think for us in the left, it's been something that we welcomed. This move in the Sahel region has been really welcomed because, it's largely an anti-imperialist sort of move. It's been also very popular. And I think the development of the alliance of the Sahel states has been very, very popular and been a very good move. And them removing themselves from ECOWAS, which has, like the AU, been quite redundant and not been able to do much. So I think that has been viewed with hope by many in South Africa who take interest in those matters, and we welcomed it. But I do think a lot of those shifts and changes have come through coups. So we'll still have to see. It's still early. You have to see what is going to be the outcomes of those in terms of local politics, in terms of what happens. I mean, someone like Thomas Sankara comes in through a coup, but does amazing things locally. But then, other coups aren't amazing. So it's still early, and we have to still see what happens in that. But I think the sentiment's been great. The fact that the sort of alliance of the Sahel has been calling for the coming together of creating reserves and the Reserve Bank outside of France, and been a really anti-imperialist position is really good. And including now Faye in Senegal, who has taken really interesting steps to talk about the true liberation of Senegal economically, and putting in those, working towards those policies have been I think should be really welcomed. But it is not something that occupies a lot of our minds here in South Africa. I mean, if you speak to other Africans, they have a view of South Africans, and South Africans themselves have their own view of themselves, and it's quite this sort of exceptionalized view. So it is. I mean, it is very difficult, to have discussions around Pan-Africanism, to have discussions about how we're going to include a view of our own history and our own future that includes the rest of Africa becomes quite difficult. We can do it in terms of rhetoric and discourse, but if you actually look at South Africa, even in its economic policies and the ways in which it deals economically with the rest of Africa, there's quite a sort of extractive model in place as well, which leads to which does lead to conflict, and then South Africa, obviously, like lots of countries, it's not just us, but lots of countries in Africa, there's a lot of xenophobia that we have. So there is that issue locally.
Yeah, and does it play a role in your activism in Pan-Africanism today? In terms of that activism, how are you following the development in, say, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, now Senegal, also Chad? They, I know that they applied, I think, to become a member of AES, the new formed alliance between the three countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Then there was, after the coup in Niger, the really heightened possibility of a war happening. And I think it's also interesting that it did not happen. I think there were forces who were ready to go to war over this, but they realized that it would be a disaster maybe for them, and where the counter forces were not ready. But this also, having said that, this also means that maybe those forces did not give up on those more aggressive plans, and are still maybe preparing the grounds for more hardline action. I remember when it was really, really fresh, the coup in Niger, that there was talk about military action coming out of Nigeria as a staging ground for all the states who would go along, like all the other ECOWAS states would go along in something like this. And it didn't happen, but I think it's not this danger is maybe still there, or it's still a possibility, right? And now Niger has taken, they were really successful in expelling the French presence in their country. And I was also always looking keenly in how will they address the US presence there. And I see popular sentiment is clear on that. They want the Americans gone, and I think also in the leadership there's they declared this openly, that they say U.S. presence is seen as illegal in their country, and I think that the United States were rather a little bit not laid back, not so vocal about what happening was there. This also led to us believing, okay, maybe they are fine with sacrificing French presence as long as it's not affecting their presence there, because as I gather, their base there in the near the capital of Niger is really important for the whole region, and
Yeah, I mean, I think for us in our activism, I mean, I'm not talking about the South African state and their policies. I'm just talking about the movements, and within Pan-Africanism and our activism, we obviously welcome these sorts of moves of different states within the continent trying to assert their independence after a very long time. It's absolutely crazy. In large parts of Francophone Africa, you can't even build a road without it being passed by the French government. I mean, that's the level of colonialism. It's like, it's not even neocolonialism. It's just an active sort of control over large parts of Africa by the French state. And, I think that these all should be welcomed. And I think we do in our activism. Obviously, it's still early days, so we're watching what's happening. The sort of economic progress that Niger has made, despite, you always get this, like, you get carrots dangled over you, but you also get the fear stick dangled over you, that if you do this, then you're going to have sanctions, and you're going to have this, and you're going to have that. And your economy is going to be destroyed. Well, our economy is all already bloody destroyed through your neoliberal policies and the sort of crazy limitations that the World Trade Organizations and, the World Bank puts onto you. So how much worse can it get? So I think that what Niger has done should become a template. I'm not saying the coup, but I'm saying the ways in which it's been able to stand up and take very decisive action with removing the French, with standing up for its true autonomy and sovereignty, not just politically, but economically. Because, as you know, if you don't have that economic freedom, your political freedom is just a show. And they've really shown us that, and still having the sort of ability to grow the economy, which is really amazing. And I think that gives a lot of hope. And I think we're doing the work to support that. We're doing the work to support working class organizations and people across the continent. And we're continuing to do that in our work as Pan-Africanism today. But I also think, and within NUMSA as well, within the labor movement, the African labor movement offers its solidarity to a lot of these organizations across the continent. But I also think what's really important is maybe for us to begin to understand, you said America was quite a bit laid back in that maybe they should just make sure that their base stays there and they don't get kicked out. I think that's a lovely position to be in relation to America, that they now they get onto their back foot. So, all of a sudden, if more countries, if over 50 countries in Africa decide to throw off the yoke of imperialism, how many countries can the United States of America go to war with? I mean, it's really a moment that we should be thinking about very seriously and organizing more seriously around, and thinking about, well, if this whole region can begin to do this, and it does put pressure on the imperialist powers, because now you have to think, okay, if I do this, and ECOWAS is not doing anything in the end. I think the threat is still there, but given that ECOWAS has been in organization since the 1970s, and it's done nothing ever in general, it's going to be very hard for it to get military powers to go and start, invading the countries around them that have actually become quite organized. So I'm hoping that their useless today history that they've shown us means that they're quite useless even on the military front. That could be the hope, maybe. But I think that if we could see this as a lesson, as a moment where countries, what happens in one, like if in the SADC region, we could say, well, what's happened in the Sahel could be an inspiration, that we now are going to throw off this yoke, and we're going to start countries, very quickly throwing off this imperialist yoke. It becomes very difficult. And America can say, okay, we might go to war with South Africa, but then there's Zimbabwe and Zambia, and we have bases in Zambia. Do we want to? So maybe Zambia is safe for a time longer. It gives you time to organize. So I think it could be a moment, a way of us to learn how to do this. And right now, the United States seems quite stretched in terms of what's happening in the Middle East just from the Palestine stuff and how that's spilling over. And then, you have the Russia-Ukraine thing. So I know that it makes its money through a war machine, but sometimes it might not be able to cope with the demand. And that could provide us with a moment where we could begin to do something really interesting. Because the fact that Niger has been able to continue, even though it's something that people were so against, and prosper, gives us hope for a moment. Doesn't mean the threat's gone, because they can always come back when they in a quieter phase of their warmongering. But the point is that if all of us are doing it together collectively, which was the vision ultimately of people like Nkrumah and Nehru and so on in the 1960s and 70s, we could really begin to chart a new way forward. So I'm always eternally optimistic for that to happen. But I think we do need to make sure that when it's happening, it happens from below, that it's happening as a broad-based movement, that it's not something that's imposed from the top, because that can very easily dissipate, and we can go back to our sort of national boundaries very easily and get caught up in what's happening internally rather than how we can build solidarity broadly.
Well, Vashna, it was really a blast talking to you, and there's so much more I would like to cover, and regarding the African continent as a whole, regarding South Africa and international subjects too. But I think we can end it here.
Yes.
And please let us know, let our audience know where they can follow if they are interested in all those subjects. I saw that Pan-Africanism Today has a Facebook page, which is fairly regular, updated, and maybe a place where people can follow the work of your party.
Yeah, I mean, they could definitely follow the NUMSA, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa page. Lots of stuff is uploaded there, and it's very regularly uploaded. The Pan-Africanism Today Facebook page. And if they do, they can also subscribe to a WhatsApp sort of a weekly pamphlet that goes out. And the details will be on the Facebook page. And that is really useful because it's just a roundup of all the news, not only of what's happening in South Africa, in Africa, but also what's happening in parts of the global South more generally, Latin America, Asia, and so on. So it's really fantastic. And it's definitely based much more on the perspectives of working class and poor people's movements and working class formations. So if they're interested in that, that would be really good. They also do host the work and the sort of latest news of Mviwata, which is a very large peasant organization out of East Africa, from Mozambique, Tanzania, and so on. So it's a really good thing to have. It's a broadcast that goes out on WhatsApp.
Okay, and the starting point to find this is the NUMSA Facebook page?
No, it'll be the Pan-Africanism Today page.
Okay, Facebook. and there you can sign up to this update?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you also have, and then the NUMSA page is also really good because it has broad news about what's happening across the continent and our own news locally and NUMSA news. So it's a whole thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I hope that we can continue the discussion in the future.
Yes.
If you
call me anytime. If I have electricity, I will be available.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Vashna.
Great. Thanks. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Kommunistische Organisation. Podcast.